Welcome to the Outlap F1 Podcast, F1 for Beginners series. Today's episode is dedicated to providing you with a soup to nuts look at the sport we love and we love to talk about, Formula One.
All right, so now let's talk about what actually makes up a Formula One car, and we will start with the engine components. So there are multiple parts that make up the powertrain of a Formula One car, and this is what actually makes the car go as fast as it does, the fastest cars in the world. We're talking about a car that produces over 1,000 horsepower and weighs about 1,000 pounds less than a Honda Civic. So you think about a Honda Civic with its 200 horsepower, add another 800 to that, and then remove 1,000 pounds just to give you an idea as to how fast these cars are. So within the Formula One engine, you have multiple parts or components. So the first one is called the internal combustion engine, also known as the ICE. So if you hear ICE, that's what they're referring to. This is a 1.6 liter V6 engine. It's really not that dissimilar to that you'll see in a normal road car and how it's actually set up. For this year, we have an increase in what is called biofuel. So Formula One for 2022 is now using 10% of its fuel must be made from renewable energy or biofuel. And F1 has a goal to be completely carbon neutral by 2030. So we're not that far away from there. So that's the internal combustion engine. Next, we have the turbocharger. So this operates very similar to anything in a modern road car. Turbochargers were first invented in Formula One and then passed down to modern road cars, and now they're back for the last chunk of years in Formula One. So this is a turbocharger. It's also referred to as a TC. It uses exhaust gases. So instead of just coming out the back of the car, these exhaust gases are used to actually make the car go faster. So what they do is they spin a turbine at extremely high rates of speed, and this pushes the spinning of the turbine, actually forces fresh air into the motor, which then creates more horsepower. The more air you have, you mix that with fuel, the higher combustion rate you have, and you create more horsepower. The next major component is what they call is a motor generator unit kinetic. You will often hear that referred to as an MGUK. This recovers wasted kinetic energy from the brakes, which is essentially the same way as what you hear as on modern road cars today, regenerative braking. All hybrid cars, electric vehicles, all use regenerative braking, and it's using that wasted energy from the actual braking process and will turn that into electricity that can then be used at a later point to produce more horsepower. The next major component is what we call the motor generator unit heat, or MGUH. In a modern day Formula One car, the MGUH works very similar to the MGUK, meaning that it can both recover and produce energy. It recovers energy from the turbo, stores it, and then uses it to spin the compressor. When you look at a turbocharger that we just mentioned a minute ago, you'll find a turbine on one end and a compressor on the other end. The exhaust gases are used to spin the turbine, which then also in turn spins a compressor. The MGUH is a component that sits in between those two parts, and when hot gases spin the turbine, it produces electricity that is stored in the batteries that are on board the car, and when the car accelerates, that electricity is used to spin the compressor on the other end of the shaft, which produces an immediate power. So a major issue with modern-day turbochargers is they have what's called turbo lag. Turbochargers must spin at an extremely high rate, RPM rate, in order to produce horsepower. And on modern road cars, it can sometimes take a second or so for those compressors to actually spool up and start to kick power. By using the MGUH, they've eliminated the need for the compressors to spool, as they essentially are always spinning, and therefore there's no turbo lag, and power application is immediate. Which is why they're so quick off the line and out of corners. The next major component that we have is called the energy store, or ES. This essentially is just a large battery that holds all of the power that was recovered from the MGUK and the MGUH. Next component is the control electronics. This is essentially just a computer. It's the brains of the whole operation that makes sure that all these pieces fire in collaboration with each other and all work in tandem. If one single part is off by just the smallest degree, the whole engine will go up in spectacular fashion and in a very expensive fashion. So everything must work in complete and perfect tandem. Each driver is allowed to use 3 internal combustion engines throughout the season. 3 MGU-H, 3 MGU-K, and 3 turbochargers for an entire 22, potentially 23 race season. And they can only use 2 energy stores and 2 control electronics over the course of the entire season. Any time that a driver must use more than that, those allotments, they will then result in a grid place penalty as a result of that. So the next major component is you're making all this horsepower. How do you actually get that power to the wheels? And that's through the gearbox and transmission. So modern day Formula One gearboxes are 8-speed manual transmissions, and they're changed via paddle shifters that, again, are very similar to what you'll see on any modern day road car today. For 2022, there's a brand new rule regarding the gearbox, which makes in prior seasons, gearbox had to be used for 6 consecutive events before they could be changed or the driver would face a penalty. Now, similar to the other components in a Formula One car, the teams are given 3 gearboxes to use for the entire season. And like the other components, they can mix and match it. They can take one part out and set it to the side for a few races and then bring it back in at a later point. As long as they don't use more than those 3 components of these 3 gearboxes in this situation, they don't have a penalty. However, like all the other components, if they go over that allotment, they will receive a grid place penalty. So those are the modern components that you will see, especially when we get later in the season, you start hearing about penalties. It's going to all primarily result in drivers using additional allotments than what they were previously given for the duration of the season. So now we're talking about horsepower. Now the next thing is, how do we stick to the track? How do we go around corners faster than anything on planet Earth? And that's where we'll turn it to Deanna to talk about aerodynamics.
Okay, so Aero. F1, it is an open wheel series, so there is no bodywork around the wheels, and they also have large front wings and rear wings and all of the other components that create incredible downforce that essentially presses the car into the track for more grip so they can go faster around the corners. It is said to be physically possible to drive an F1 car upside down with the amount of downforce that is created. So F1, the bodywork, it's very, very strong. It's mostly carbon fiber. It can take enormous amounts of air pressure pushing against it. But in the same vein, it's also very fragile when it comes into contact with other objects, be it cars or the barrier. We have seen lots of carbon fly all over the place on many occasions. So this bodywork, it is extremely complex, making them the fastest cars in the world. However, this complexity has come at a cost, which can make passing cars more difficult. And this is what is called dirty air. And we have new regulations that are aimed at addressing this issue. But dirty air, simply, it occurs mostly in the corners, and this leads the car to effectively the lead car. It uses up all that nice clean air up on, and then leaves the car behind. It spits it up in all of the fancy aero bits, and then spits all of that air to the car behind. And then that car behind no longer has the clean air to use. And so that reduces the downforce of the car behind. They can't go as fast and can't follow as close, simply in the most simple explanation I can think of. So, and this makes racing difficult. And now these 2022 regulations are attempting to address that. So the first thing and the biggest rule change that we have this year is the aerodynamics. They have changed to reintroduce ground effect. This is something that we saw in the late 70s and early 80s. However, this is a little bit different. Back then they had side skirts, which acted as a seal. That was more traditional real ground effect. But what we have in this car is under the floor, we will have these underfloor tunnels that will, in the simplest way possible, suck the car towards the ground. And it's also a benefit because that underfloor downforce is better preserved when it's following the cars in front, and it's not as sensitive to all that dirty air, unlike the wings to the wake from the car in front. So also to limit this dirty air issue with these regulations, we have simplified the front and the rear wings. The floor has been simplified. We've removed barge boards, which were these complex structures that designed to just direct the airflow all over the place, which made it a nightmare for the car behind. So we also have wheel covers that have been added to reduce the wake created by the tires. So hopefully all of that together will create better racing. And yeah, that's all I got.
So for those of you who only listen to the podcast, this is a perfect example why you need to watch on YouTube. If you ever find yourself playing charades and get the phrase aerodynamic things, Deanna just gave you a perfect example of the hand gesture to use to describe that. It was something like this. So make sure you go check that out.
I don't think my hand gestures will help on that one.
You really
I don't know.
I tend to use it throughout the season.
I could visually see the air flowing through the room as you were doing that. I think it was
vortices everywhere.
Yeah,
exactly. It was a perfect illustration.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about the one part of the car that's meant to actually make contact with the track surface, and that is the tires. F1 has one tire manufacturer, and that's Pirelli. Pirelli designs a total of 7 different types of tires for Formula One, 5 that can be used in dry weather, and 2 that are used in the wet weather conditions. Starting this year, we now have 18-inch wheels with a lower profile tire wrapped around that. And then each race weekend, Pirelli chooses 5 of those 7 types, depending on the track characteristics. You'll always have 3 dry tire types and always have 2 wet tire types. You'll have a soft, medium, and hard. They've simplified that from just a few years ago when you'd have things like hyper soft, ultra soft, regular soft, and then like hard. Was it ultra hard and hyper hard? I don't think so. Super hard? I don't even remember.
I think it was super really hard, and then they never.
There was a medium and a hard, and then all sorts of soft.
Yeah, there's a lot of colors. It got really weird. They simplified it. You got soft, medium, hard, but those tire can actually change from race to race between C1 is the hardest through C5 being the softest. Theoretically, the C5 should be the fastest, but some tracks could actually be better suited for the C4s. Depending on corners and things, the tires could get overheated earlier in the lap and then actually end up hurting your lap time as that lap went on. So then, of course, you get to your intermittent tires and your full wet tires. Kind of interesting, Pirelli will release the package of tires that they're going to give each team a few weeks ahead of the races. And actually this year, the Melbourne race, the tire allocations have come out and they decided to skip a compound for the first time under these current tire regs. So we'll actually see the C2, C3, and C5, which is different because typically you'd always see the 3 consecutive in a row, like C2, 3, 4, or like 3, 4, 5 on a weekend. So just something to note there. Now to talk about pit stops. Under dry weather conditions, F1 cars are required by rule to make at least 1 pit stop and are forced to use at least 2 different types of tires. If it is deemed a wet weather race, teams are not required to pit and use multiple tires or multiple types of tires. However, they typically would still pit once for a fresh set of wet weather tires to remain competitive. F1 cars do not refuel during a race. They start the race with the same or with the amount of fuel needed to complete the entire race distance. And since pit stops consist of just changing tires and minor wing aerodynamic adjustments, they are extremely fast. Currently, the world record was set in 2019 at the Brazilian Grand Prix by the RedBull team, who changed 4 tires in 1.82 seconds. RedBull won the fastest pit stop for the 4th straight year last year and had 10 of the top 11 fastest stops in 2022. 4 of them were below 2 seconds, with the fastest being 1.88 seconds in Hungary. You could basically take every pit stop Red Bull has over the course of an entire 22-23 race season, and it'll still be less time than it took Mercedes to change just 1 set of tires at 2 different races over the last couple seasons. So just throwing that out there. New rules were implemented mid-season to try and slow down those pit stops, but Red Bull adjusted and still led the way. All right, let's get to DRS Andy.
So, as Deanna mentioned, one of the problems that F1 has had for a very, very long time has been this dirty air concept. So, what can we do to try to combat the dirty air? Well, one of the things that she just talked about was 2022 regulations. Well, prior to that, we had this system called DRS, which stands for Drag Reduction System. So, on the rear wing of an F1 car, what would happen is if you are within 1 second of the driver in front in race conditions, and you are in what is called the DRS zone, and the FIA designates what the DRS zones are on each particular track before the event. You can open the rear flap. The rear wing actually has a flap, and this will open. It will actually open up this year as opposed to opening down like it had done in some prior years. But it's basically meant to reduce the amount of drag on the car, make it go faster in a straight line. you would typically are able to see a 7 to 8 mile an hour advantage over the car in front of them. So this is the combat of the dirty air concept. On a typical track, like we said, there's usually 2 or 3. Monaco is the only exception. They only have 1. They are typically not allowed under race conditions to be used until after 2 laps into a race or 2 laps after a safety car, a period, or even possibly even a double wave yellow flag. They could discontinue it at the FIA's discretion. So the hope is that with the 2022 regulations, DRS may become a thing of the past, but it is at least in the rules and the regs for this year and probably for next year as well.
So moving on to the Halo, and this is the safety feature. It is an oblong-shaped piece of titanium that starts directly in the front of the driver's head and proceeds to go above and around the driver's head, forming a halo. So the halo was introduced in 2018 and was put into place to protect the driver's head from being hit by large pieces of debris or another car wrecking on top of the driver. It can also help protect the driver in event of a rollover crash. In a major crash last season, it saved Roman Grosjean's life when his car pierced the Aramco barrier and he was able to miraculously survive. So we thank the Halo for many, many things since its introduction. So,
yeah. So the next piece is, we've talked about aero, we talked about tires and everything else. How do you tell these cars apart? How do you tell which driver's which? We were trying to pick a driver to follow. So unlike a lot of forms of racing, each team has their own specific livery, but each team runs the same livery for both their drivers. So identical cars. So it can be very difficult to tell them apart, whether you're at the track or even watching on TV. How do you quickly tell who's who when you're seeing them fly by at very high rates of speed? So with being difficult, there's a thing that it's not primarily used for this, but the color of it is a very easy determination of which driver is which. So on every team, there's a primary driver, or called the number 1 driver, and there's a number 2 driver as well. So the number 1 driver is typically the more experienced driver in most situations. We have a few situations in Formula 1 where the driver bringing the most money to the team based on their sponsorship deals have been, or their fathers own the team, have been deemed the number 1 driver, even though their teammate is more experienced than them. But in a typical arrangement, typically the more experienced driver is the number 1, and the number 2 driver is the least experienced driver on that team. So at the top of the car, there's something called a T-bar. The T-bar is essentially a piece of metal that is shaped like a T at the very top. It's the most highest elevated point on the vehicle. And for the primary drivers, in every single race, the primary driver, the T-bar, will be painted black. And on the secondary, the number 2 driver, for every single race, the T-bar will be painted yellow. So when they're coming at you at a high rates of speed, or if you're at the track and you're looking and you see a RedBull go by, you know that if it's black on the top, you know that's MaxVerstappen. And if you see a yellow go by, you know that's Checo Perez. The easiest way to do it, because it's the same for every single race, is once you figure out what driver is your person to follow, is learn these small minute differences in the car, because it's going to be the same for every single race. You know that your driver is either going to be the black T-bar or the yellow T-bar. Obviously, with every single car, they have their own individual numbers. So a few years back, Formula 1 went to more of a traditional style numbering system where every driver picks their own number, and that is their number for the rest of time. The only exception of that is the reigning champion has the option to run the number 1 during the following season. To date, that had not been used previously since the new numbering system had been introduced. However, for the first time in 2021, we will have Max Verstappen running the number 1 driver, as he is the reigning world champion. Running the number 1 as he's the reigning world champion. So, so each car has their own number, but these numbers can be very difficult to see. Sometimes they're mixed in. Sometimes they're using colors that are very similar to the overall livery of the car. They're more for a design aesthetic and not really there to help drivers or to help fans see which driver is which based on being in person or on TV. So primarily the yellow T-bar or the black T-bar is going to be the primary thing that you can use, regardless of where you're looking at the track, to follow your driver all season long and see where they're at on track.
All right, moving on to F1 racing terminology. First up, we have lights out. You might hear that when you hear lights out, and away we go. Simply put, at the start of the race, all the drivers, you get a reconnaissance lap early on, then you get your formation lap. After the formation lap, everybody lines up in their grid spot, and then you'll see 5 red lights go on one at a time. Once all 5 are on, they'll all go out at the same time, hence lights out. And at that point, it's game on. The race is starting. Probably the most stressful part of most race weekends, because typically the start of the race is when the shit hits the fan for the first time. So it's typically very, very exciting. Some tracks more than others. But when you hear that lights out and away we go, man, we got 11 days from right now till we hear that for the first time for real, and can't wait. All right, so then during the race you have undercut. Undercutting involves a driver making a pit stop a few laps earlier than the car ahead of them. This ensures the driver has a fresher set of tires, which can help them overtake the worn-out tires of their opponent. Probably easily one of the most used strategies in F1. So you're going to hear undercut a lot. You're also going to hear overcut quite a bit. The overcut is where you pass by, staying out after your opponent pits and being faster on your old tired in lap, then they can go on their new tired out lap, usually because the new tires have not come up to temperature fast enough. Next up, you have lift and coast. This is the most effective technique for driving flat out, but doing so in an efficient manner that enables fuel consumption targets to be maintained. Remember, I did mention that there is no refueling during the race, so whatever you have at the start is all you get, and if you run out, that sucks. If you don't have enough for a sample at the end, you get booted from the race.
Qualified.
Ask Sebastian Vettel how that goes. Minimizing time loss and reducing the opportunity for rivals to take advantage, letting go of the accelerator and using engine braking to save fuel during race as opposed to flat out driving. What do you got for us, Deanna?
All right, so next up is team orders, and these are instructions that the team gives to the driver, typically in regards to telling them to swap places. And that could be for a number of reasons, whether the driver behind is on a quicker pace, a different strategy, or they're ahead in the championship, and that is a strategic team decision to give that driver more points. And then next up is downforce, and this is something that we covered a little bit earlier, but the aerodynamic force that is applied in a downwards direction as a car travels forward. This is harnessed to improve a car's traction and its handling through corners. So next up is the safety car. So this is deployed when there is an incident on track that cannot be cleared quickly. So they deploy the safety car, which this year is either a Mercedes or an Aston Martin, and it's basically deployed to bunch the cars up so that they can clear that incident and slow them all down. But if it is a smaller incident, then you can deploy the VSC or the virtual safety car. So again, this is for smaller incidents when a marshal can just run on track, clear, say, debris from a front wing, something like that. And this appears on the driver's dash, and they reduce their speed to roughly 30% slower than a normal race lap speed.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about some of the different lap terminology that you're going to hear throughout an F1 weekend. One of those said laps, it's also a great name for a podcast, it's called the outlap. And the outlap is when you are coming out of the pits and you are on your fresh tires, and they may not be fully up to temperature, but it is a very important lap because if you're trying to maximize your tire life, or you're trying to maximize your tire performance, the best chance you're probably going to have to do that is on your outlap. So it is a very important lap. We also have, conversely, the in-lap, which is also extremely important in an F1 weekend. That's when you are trying to maximize your performance. Most team engineers will say, give it 100% pace, give it everything, use those tires up, because you're going to try to crash yourself without crashing into the pits. You're trying to maximize the velocity that you're using before you have to get down to pit lane speed in order to minimize the time that your car is on pit road. So outlap, very important. In-lap, very important. You'll also hear during the course of a weekend what happens if a driver is on something called a hot lap. Well, what the heck is that? A hot lap is basically a lap at racing speed. Typically in practices, a lot of times, because of the way the tires work, you'll have a quick lap where you'll set a time, and then you'll have to slow the car down for a lap recharge your batteries, let the car cool down a little bit, and cool the tire temperatures down a little bit as well. So you'll have, so if you're not on a hot lap, you're basically required by the rules to get off the racing line and don't infringe drivers who are on hot laps. We've seen some incidents during qualifying sessions with certain drivers being on hot laps and certain drivers not being on hot laps, and that can create some issues.
Thanks for tuning in to our F1 for Beginners series. Make sure to check out the rest of the episodes in this series, as well as our race previews and reviews for every race throughout the season on our YouTube channel. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, Discord, and Reddit at Outlet F1 Podcast. Do us a solid and click like and subscribe on YouTube, or click that 5-star button if you're an Apple Podcast or Spotify.
And as always, may all your laps be fast.